I'm delighted to be chairing this panel and to be welcoming you back to the third day of our conference. I think it's been an absolutely excellent event so far. And I think the papers that we've had, the conversations, the research that people have been prepared to share with us in such a generous way has really, I think, brought out why this has been such an important event. And I say this not as the person who had the idea for this event, although I'm on the organising committee. I'm entirely unoriginal in this. I just came in at a late stage after Hannah and Eric had these ideas. So I am not singing my own praises, purely singing those of Eric and Hannah. So I think
phrases, that's fine.
It's just not a very English thing to do. So or at least that's what we pretend. But thank you all for joining us. This panel is one where we're discussing pre-recorded papers by Sven-Erik Rose, Christin Klotz, and Katarzyna Person. The format that we will basically follow here is that the speakers, or the people who are speakers, will speak very briefly about their papers or say one or two things. And I've had someone say that they weren't put on notice that that's what they had to do. So that's absolutely fine. I think a sort of brief summary or some brief points of what you were thinking when you were working on the paper would be great. I'll say or ask a few things after that, and the panelists will respond to them. And then that's the kind of point roughly where questions come in from the audience, although panelists will also have the chance to ask each other questions, perhaps before the audience's questions come in. But I think we can make this relatively free-flowing. We don't have to be absolutely rigid about this. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to go to start, or shall I volunteer someone myself? Perhaps
I'm happy to start, but we could,
okay,
whatever.
Yeah. Eric, if
that works.
Okay, so if we go, well, I suppose also Katja, since you're ill, where would you?
Yeah, why don't you have? Why don't you, yeah, absolutely.
No, you look happy about it. Okay, so if we go Eric, Kasia, Anna, that's sort of in roughly chronological order as in the material that you're dealing with, sort of. So maybe not, but yeah.
Okay, Eric. Thank you for
thank you.
Yes, thank you all for being here. I'm really enjoying this conference. So my talk, just to recap briefly, was about Yitzhak Bernstein, who was an active Mitarbeiter in the Oinig Shabbos project, and he wrote quite rather prolifically, and a number of his texts are preserved in the first cache of the Oinig Shabbos that was buried in August 1942 and unearthed in September 1946. He has nothing in the second cache. And I am focusing on him as he really has an ethical bent. So he really thinks in ethical terms and is trying to kind of interpret the unfolding events. And he starts writing early, sort of right from the occupation before the establishment of the ghetto, and writes until about the time of the Soviet invasion. So about a 2-year period. And although some of his texts are not exactly dated, generally speaking, it's possible to follow a chronology of his events and how is he sort of employing ethical sort of paradigms and moral paradigms to think about the events. And so in my talk, I take you through a series of writings of different kind of generically sort of different writings by Bernstein. And I'm interested in sort of what happens to this paradigm of ethics. Does it kind of hold up, or does it sort of crumble? And generally speaking, they move from a relative kind of competence and optimism even about sort of the ethical effects of the events of the initial invasion. He thinks this is kind of it's a terrible catastrophe, but it maybe will be a sort of a moral wake-up call and bring the community together and bring people to remember what is fundamentally important, and solidarity and generosity, and to a point in the ghetto where it just becomes impossible to even judge behavior because people are so abject and devoid of agency. And that's really, I think, the key question of ethics is really, it assumes agency, right? And that's, I think, why it's such an interesting category, that he's thinking through what agency do we have, and what can we and should we be doing, to a point where it almost becomes impossible to think in those terms when people have so little room for agency. So I'll just stop there. The talk is heavy on quotes because it's a man who has not been very read or quoted and listened to, and I wanted to give him some space. But that's basically the architecture of the project at this point. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. And Kasia, if you want to say a few words.
Sure. Thank you very much. And as Eric said, this is an incredible conference, and it's really a privilege to be here. My paper dealt with editorial changes which were done by employees of the Jewish Historical Institute when publishing documents from the underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. The very fact that such changes were taking place in Stalinist Poland is, of course, nothing special. We do know, and there's extensive research now on in-house censorship, which was carried out by publishing houses, by editors, by authors themselves, even before the book or article reached the main office for control of the press, publishing and performances. And for many, and I think, as I claim, also for employees of the Jewish Historical Institute, following official state censorship guidelines and introducing such changes even in advance was considered a price worth paying for publication, even if they did not state it explicitly. Thus, the changes which I mentioned, those carried out by the director of the Jewish Historical Institute, Bermark, and also by other employees, allowed for the narrative of the Holocaust to enter into the very restrictive at that point public discourse of Poland, and to ensure the existence and continued publishing of the Jewish Historical Institute at a time when the state was increasingly shutting down other Jewish institution. But what I think is important is that these changes were not only aimed at conforming to the communist ideology and the demands of the communist state apparatus, but they also were aimed at constructing a new image of Jews during the Holocaust, one that was not necessarily in line with that which was shown in documents in the Ringable archive. So it was creating an image of Jews for the needs, to meet the needs of the post-war Jewish community. So in this way, I'm showing how the Ringable archive became a vital part of the construction of Holocaust memory in post-war Poland, but in the version which was prepared by editors of the Jewish Historical Institute.
That's great. Thanks, Kasia. Great, and we'll move on to Anna now, if you would just like to say a few words.
Definitely. So yeah, hello again for everyone who doesn't know me. My name is Anna Klotz, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Hebrew University since 2 years. And since 1 year, I started to work on survivor Landsmannschaften in Eastern Europe, mostly on the former Polish territory. And I was like, when I started this research, I was looking at the survivor community mostly from a point of like migrant self-help and the role and function of the survivor Landsmannschaften in grief work and memorial work and Holocaust remembrance, but also exhumations and reburials. And then I was reading this call for paper for the conference, and it really like kept me thinking what actually the place of Yiddish, the role of Yiddish within these Survivorlandsmannschaften played, because already like during my first involvement with these Landsmannschaften, I came across many testimonies, especially by children of survivors, and they often really mentioned the emotional role of Yiddish for their parents who were involved in various Survivorlandsmannschaften all over the globe. So I started to collect these testimonies and these sources, and I started also to try to map out these Survivorlandsmannschaften when they popped up, where they moved to, if they split up or rebuilt, if they then joined in migration, older established Landsmannschaften, or not. And like in this talk, then I really tried to look at these Survivorlandsmannschaften as Yiddish-speaking communities, and really trying to understand what the emotional role, or in general the role of Yiddish was within these communities. And I also found there was like a stark difference also between like elderly established Landsmannschaften from the pre-war times in the United States, for example, and then these newly Survivorlandsmannschaften, which really already also popped up while World War II was still ongoing. And I also tried to think about the continuities until today, and their role in really like trying to preserve Yiddish as a motivation for many of the people involved in the Landsmannschaften, and like trying to think or see some continuities for today and the revival of the secular Yiddish culture in places like New York or Berlin. We see it also in Warsaw, and so on. So yeah, these were like my thoughts for the conclusion. Yeah, maybe I stop here.
That's great. That's great, Anna. Thank you. And I can see that there are some questions already being put in the chat, which is great. I mean, do feel free to put questions in. I'll, as I said, I'll say or ask a couple of things, but then we can sort of move into opening up this discussion in other ways. So I suppose I'm never very good at being one of those people who ask the sort of question that I can put to every single member of the panel. So I might just sort of try and do it a slightly different way, and maybe sort of carry on picking on you, Anna, and just ask. I mean, the two of the things that kind of came out quite strongly from Eric and Katarzyna's papers were a way of thinking about sort of ethical judgments. I mean, Eric started his talk by saying that this is something that we often feel uncomfortable about, but it seems important. And one of the ways, as he said just now, is this way of thinking about agency. And Kash, I think also another thing that kind of makes us, I'm sure, feel uncomfortable is the way in which censorship or self-censorship operates. And one of the points that you're making, aside from the external constraints on it, is the way that that's a form of community building, or a form of memory work as well, I think you said. I wondered, Anna, if there was anything that those kind of thoughts had to say to your work. Are there ways in which people are making judgments? And then perhaps we could talk about that in terms of the use of Yiddish, or perhaps not, or in terms of sort of self-censorship, or the ways in which that kind of there's rules of what can be said and what can't be said, and what can be remembered and what can't be remembered.
And definitely, I think it's a little bit, like how agency plays out in these Survivorlandsmannschaften I researched, and the function they had, and the many things they conducted. But what I found quite striking is really like how many survivors in their memories form it really as a form of like resilience also, because like many of them, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah or while the Shoah was still going on, couldn't like openly use the language, of course. And also after the Shoah and with the destruction of like nearly of the language and the memory and the culture which comes with Yiddish, I think engaging in these Landsmannschaften with Yiddish and also to making it like publicly visible is a form of agency, and it's like it has really like this resilience in it. And you could even like, yeah, call it for some, I think, resistance, because we also had like these marches of survivor Landsmannschaften through the destroyed cities, but then you see it also in the towns where the DP camps were in Germany and in Italy, and like really engaging publicly in Yiddish and openly among an environment who's like mainly hostile or indifferent about you and that you survived and about your language and your culture. I think here comes like really in this moment of agency, and it's also ethically coined. For many, it was like really a motivation. Yeah, but it's different to the other two papers, I would say. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I suppose, if a feature of resistance movements, a resistance movement might be pushing it a little bit beyond what you're also saying when you say maybe it's resistance, but okay, a certain degree of discipline, right? You might call self-policing. Is there anything like that you're seeing going on?
From some sources, like early testimonies I read, or like letters exchanged also between these survivor Landsmannschaften or individual survivors who reached out to Landsmannschaften, who also reached out to the elderly established Landsmannschaften. They sometimes talk about like changing the language, like trying to speak German when they were in a DP camp and with the environment, and not speaking Yiddish. And I also see this. Yeah, it's maybe not. It's not self-limitation. It's the other way around. But what I found really was when the moment survivors would join an elderly established Landsmannschaft, they came up a lot of conflicts because they had, for them, Yiddish had this emotional meaning, which was now really connected with grief and the destruction and suffering. And they were often, you hear this often in survivor testimonies, disappointed that, for example, elderly established Landsmannschaften in New York would commemorate the Shoah with a song in Polish and not in Yiddish. And so after joining these Landsmannschaften, some would withdraw and then form their old, form new survivor Landsmannschaften, for example, in their own circles. So here you see like this, yeah, how do you say it? Attention, I would say attention, but it's I didn't came across of so many like material sources from that time which really speak about or reflect about non-using Yiddish or not using Yiddish. But in testimonies, survivors often reflect of that they had like some fear, and that they were like really cautious when to use Yiddish and how to also make yourself visible when speaking Yiddish and engaging publicly in Yiddish. Yeah.
Right. So that sort of suggests that it's not just that there was that tension that they mentioned in their testimony, but it's also a degree of reluctance to talk about that tension itself in the moment, or at least to leave a record of that. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, and Eric and Kasia, I mean, it may be that you just want to respond to what Anna's been saying or what each other has said. I mean, I suppose one thought that I had is that you both are interested in or that you both mentioned in your talks the figure of Bear Mark and I wondered if there were things that you wanted to say about his role or the way, I mean, whether you see his role in the same way. I know, Eric, you've written about Mark in other contexts as well. Yes, perhaps. So that might be what you could think about, or if you want to respond to each other's papers, I think it's probably time for us to move on to that as well.
Yeah, well, actually, Mark is sort of a way that it's my question for Kasia, and I can respond. So I can kind of respond a little bit and then
ask
pose
away.
Question to, okay, great, if that works. Bernstein is relatively unknown. I think probably most of you maybe don't know him. I'm sure David Roskis knows him, and some of you may know him. But he only one text was published, and that was published by Bermark. So that's kind of the link, and that's his sort of prose poem to Warsaw, which is retitled by Bermark, and it's kind of confusing because he takes the title. It actually is a title, more or less, that Bernstein uses for a different text, but. And he does, as I indicated, sort of change a few lines. And as I read it in that prose poem, which is a quite remarkable text, and it's included in his anthology of Warsaw Ghetto writings, Zwischen Leben und Tod, a very important anthology of writings from the Warsaw Ghetto, literary writings, more or less, from the Warsaw Ghetto. It's a light sort of intervention, but certainly a significant intervention. That he changes, and I think it's, as I read it, it's exactly when Bernstein is actually sort of holding the broader community to account for, and this is a category that I just thought of yesterday, and it alarmed me, and I'll just throw it out there. So I have not processed as I work through it, but in a sense, and this is a problematic category, the most problematic category of the three that are used widely in Holocaust research of perpetrator, victim, and bystander. The bystander, I think everybody by now agrees, is a problematic category, and certainly a way too expensive category that needs a lot of precision. But he's, in a sense, accusing the community of being bystanders, right? They're saying that people are just going about their business, even people with food and money, or relative access to some food and some money, and not giving it to people who are absolutely destitute. And he's calling them to task. And I think exactly at those kinds of moments, Bermark seems to intervene when he says, this is a real, I can't remember the actual word, I could find it, but I don't want to waste time. But as I read it, he's sort of toning it down and saying that you can accuse the Judenrat of moral failures, right? You can accuse, but you can't accuse the broad community, right? The masses or the people most generally, so you can't really go there. And in a certain sense, he is kind of going there, although it's clear that he's talking about people with some kind of resources. But at any rate, so I think that's kind of generally, and that maybe goes to Kasia's point, is that following a kind of pressure of a Stalinist kind of pressure, or is that more about upholding an image or a self-image, a positive image of the Jewish community that he doesn't want to see? You can say that this is a catastrophe, but you can't say it's a moral catastrophe or a moral failure on the part of the Jewish, an ethical failure. I'm not using really a distinction between those terms, as I probably should be, but is it an ethical failure of the Jewish community, and you also have to remember, these are, and this is so important, these are texts in real time, right? And if he had lived and looked back, he would have absolutely changed his ethical understanding of what was going on, and that's, I think, what makes you so uncomfortable, right, when you're pronouncing ethical judgment. But you have to make those judgments with the situation at hand, with the information you have available, and and it's very unsettled and very raw and very difficult to encounter. So that's what I can say about Mark's involvement. He did publish it, and I think that goes to the ambiguity, and he also has to kind of say this is a terrible, sort of almost expressionistic, mythical, kind of a mystical, actually, sort of text. And he sort of lambasts other texts that he doesn't reproduce but does allude to by Bernstein. And is that a case where maybe he really thinks this guy's a mystical weirdo who had, this kind of obsession with Kiddush Hashem and a kind of mystical bent that didn't look at what Bermark would say the actual causes, right? Kind of quasi-class distinctions in the ghetto, that there were rich people and poor people, and the poor people were being exploited by the rich people. Kind of grotesque to try to take that model into the Warsaw Ghetto, if you ask me. But at any rate, is it a question of him sort of making a concession to Stalinist pressures, basically, and sort of towing the line in order to publish this text, which is going to be, look, not very kosher, sort of according to a Stalinist sort of paradigm? Or does he actually believe that? And that's sort of my question to Kasia. Bermark has always seemed to me a rather slippery figure, and I've always had trouble. Sometimes I definitely can see that he's making concessions in order to get things out, and you can kind of see him as almost like a sort of heroic, valiant sort of figure who's protecting and getting these things published in a Stalinist context, which is amazing that he managed to do that and not get the Jewish Historical Institute shut down, and we are all in his debt for that. On the other hand, in some level, he must be some kind of a true believer too, or maybe not. And so I wonder, is from your infinitely more informed perspective, is Bermark a kind of a legible figure to you? Does he look like, yeah, I get exactly what he's doing? Or, and with all the caveats that we can't peer into someone's soul, and even if we could, the answers would be complex and not unequivocal. But when you look at Bermark, you say, yeah, he totally makes sense to me. I don't have questions about what his motivations were, or I don't really know. Was he a communist true believer? Was he behind some of these sort of interventions, or was he simply sort of tortured by them, but he made concessions to the powers that be and did what he had to do? So kind of, it's hard for me to kind of place him on that spectrum, and I don't know exactly. He's kind of slippery for me in that sense. So I would, if you could illuminate that, that would be great. So that's my question for you.
Thank you, and I really don't think I can answer that, in a sense that there's a famous Joanna Kulikoff's article about him, which is called Three Colors Gray, about Bermark, and he's gray. I don't think anybody can tell. He's a pre-war communist, he's a believer, but at the same time, he has a task. And I think that heroic aspect, which you mentioned, of him consciously doing things in order to keep the institute going, are undoubtedly there. The aspect of cutting out things from Polish publications of documents from Regal Archive in order not to feed anti-Semitic feelings in the country, or unsuccessfully, though, as we know, in a sense that Regal Archive is widely used in 1968 in press campaigns against, as part of the anti-Zionist campaign in 1968. So that doesn't work out, but nonetheless, that's clear. But then we get to the bit when he's cutting out those same parts from Yiddish publications, and these are not parts which have to be cut due to political censorship. He does it out of his own. He just does it. So, in that sense, that's something that really brought me into the topic as well. Was this not so much the fact that they were censored, because that's understandable, but this difference between Polish editions, Yiddish editions of the same documents, and the fact that Yiddish editions are nonetheless heavily censored, not only politically, but also in terms of morally, let's say, or ethically, however we call it. Because I think I was sort of living in this Elie Wiesel vision of, like, the true Yiddish text, and then the different translations, publicly. But it's not true. He did actually also very strongly censor the Yiddish publications, which were of course aimed at the internal Jewish leadership.
If I could just add very, very briefly, Kasia, I know you've written on this text by Skolov, a novel, the only novel that has been preserved, not the only novel that was attempted from the Warsaw Ghetto by Skolov. Zalman Skolov. There, he actually, and you've written about it, so I know you know this, but he cut out lots and lots of things that were sort of problematic, more from maybe a Jewish perspective, or his Jewish perspective, than from a communist perspective. But in that text, he actually adds, and I wonder if you've ever seen that happen anywhere else. I haven't, but you know this way more than I do. He actually adds lines, not only repress, that's the normal thing, is to cut out things, but he actually adds a sentence here and there to make a character more communist, like to make a character, and this character was out, carrying a banner for the communists. And so and that was astonishing to me. It's not in the text, but it's in the published text, so when you go back to the archival text, it's actually not there, and he adds things rather than simply subtracts. And I thought that was astonishing. I don't know if you've seen that phenomenon anywhere.
Yes, it is so. I haven't come across things like that in the Regal markup. He changes words, so puts different words and stuff,
Yeah.
but not. I've never seen him actually adding something, though it
Yeah.
sounds very much like him.
Perhaps we can turn to some of the questions in the chat. I know David posted that you have a question and comment for each speaker. Would you like to come
Yes.
on the microphone and
So I had a question and a comment for each of you. So I'll just go in order very briefly. Eric, you really deserve a lot of credit for putting Yitzhak Bernstein on the map. The only piece of his that I've ever read is the one that's in Zwischen Leben und Tod. So you've really accomplished something very important. I'm just basing my question on the order in which you presented the quotations. It seems to me that at the beginning, he uses a very secular diction when he's still rather optimistic and upbeat. He's talking in a very universalistic language and genre. And then as we go through, he adopts the Hellfire sermon mode of the Kellner Maggid. And then before you know it, he's talking about Yom Kippur and the book of Ruth. But it strikes me as really profoundly important that as his vision becomes darker and the moral indictment gathers force, the language and the genre become more traditional. So that's my takeaway. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. That's my question. Okay. To Katarzyna, I don't even know how to pronounce your name properly. I'm sorry. Here's my thought that to contextualize what's going on with Wehrmacht and company, it would be helpful to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting. And that can be done in the following way. That some of the examples that you brought about changing Shegets to Poyer, these were techniques that were already adopted in Soviet Yiddish literature in the 1930s. And we know this from Spiegel auf Verstehen, which has a vast scholarly apparatus of all the textual emendations that the poets themselves made to their own poetry as they reissued them in the 1930s. So that's sort of panel A, how Soviet internal censorship works across the board. But panel C is other forms of censorship. Leivik rewrote edited Kaczerginski's Lieder von die Ghettos und Lagern, and he prettified it. It's an Überdichtung. He omitted anything that was vulgar, anything that might offend the post-war ethical sensibility, because after all, they were all martyrs, and you can't allow them to utter obscenities. Okay, so that's in America. And then you mention Ruta Shakovska's footnote about we can't even insert this about the Jewish police. This is so terrible, I can't even allow myself to publish it. The Jewish police were taboo much longer than you would imagine. As late as the 1990s, you couldn't, in Yad Vashem, they would not allow Tzalek Perechowski's memoir, diary, to be published because he was a Jewish policeman. The subject was completely and utterly taboo until the beginning of the current century. So that's just another way, I think, of that I'm suggesting that you can help us understand what's going on in Poland with clearer focus. And to Anne, I want to say, it's such a rich topic. My reading of what you presented, and particularly I was fascinated by the visual materials, the slides, is that it's not so much about the rescue of secular Yiddish culture, but rather the role of the Landsmannschaften in creating a Jewish civil religion, a Jewish civil religion. So in the Vilna Landsmannschaft in Berlin, you have the logo of the ghetto in the background, because this has now become a new sacred iconography. In the Lublin Zusammenflieh in Lublin, it says in quote, in brackets, it's the first day of Slichas. So this is, instead of going to shul, that's what they're saying. We're not going to say Slichas in shul. We're going to gather and commemorate. So, and I also know this because I grew up with this culture, and my parents took us to the various Landsmannschaften, and there was a new secular calendar. Bialystok was in August, and Vilna was in September, and obviously the Warsaw Ghetto was in April. So you have a whole new calendar that is created, not to speak of all the other amazing things that you described, the exhumation of graves and the marches, and that, I think, would help you understand how Yiddish becomes a sacred language. So I think that's really what we're looking at here. This is not a bridge to klezmer music in the 21st century. This is something the next movement of the transvaluation of values, where a culture that was completely imbued with secularism as a result of the Holocaust becomes sacralized.
Since you commented on my work first, I'll go first. Thank you so much, David. I think that what you say is probably right, and I'm going to thank you so much for that. I'm going to go back and look at it again. Bernstein he taught Jewish religion at a Jewish state school. So as I understand from Kasia, that would simply be a Polish school, but basically in a Jewish neighborhood. So the students would have been Jewish, but it was not a private Jewish school, but a state school, but yet a Jewish school. So he taught religion. He did publish things. I mean, he published secular articles in Yiddish, among other places, and he also did a book that I really want to try to find, but I haven't been able to locate, on the prophets and the significance of prophecy. This is probably before the war in the current age, and so he did have a certain, definitely a kind of religious outlook and framework. So even not in his academic articles, but even in the beginning when he's doing, and I agree, it is a much more secular kind of mode. But even when he's talking about, say, Mendele and Peretz, he refers to Mendele as the strict, Hasidic sort of kateger, and Peretz as the Seneger, who is always willing to see the positive kind of intention and heart of the Jewish people versus being strict. So he has a kind of, he has certainly religious categories, even when he's in his quote unquote more secular bent. But I think, and there are some texts that I didn't quote, like Moich and Hearts is one that's really a sort of a plaidoyer for more support for writers and intellectuals, as being the Moich and Hearts of the community. Easy for an intellectual to say, right? And also Devent, which is a little bit less of a slightly, somewhat less religious, but not completely unreligious sort of idiom. But you're absolutely right. And the occasional pieces for the gloss on or the drash on Ruth, for Shavuos and Yom Kippur, absolutely. And I think some of his and even the Vash poem has a lot of kind of religious overtones. So I think when it gets to be more impassioned and more pained, I think, he does seem to have recourse to a more traditional idiom and framework. I think that's correct, and thank you for that. I'm going to be much more attentive to that when I re-look at these texts. I'm working on an article on this, so thank you.
I wonder if perhaps Anna might want to go next. And there's a question in the chat that perhaps if it's a piggyback on that, if you want to respond to both of them, perhaps. So there's a question from the general public asking for more information about the survivor marches that you mentioned, how many there were, where they took place, when, and how local non-Jews responded. So if you would mind responding to both David and those questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and the comment. It's really helpful for me because I was thinking like it's a good framework, I think, as you say, to think more about that it's a creation of a new Jewish civil religion. I like always thought more in terms of, but it fits, I think, that Yiddish became so connected with like the Holocaust remembrance and this building of this new Shoah commemoration, and it was so connected with these emotions of grief and mourning and remembering, and it holds a lot of emotional space. But like just to clarify my afterthoughts about the continuities, I wasn't thinking about the klezmer culture or anything like this. Which is often also, there's a lot of critics about this, of course. But I was thinking more that the Landsmannschaften also fulfilled this function that they somehow rescued the idea of the Yiddish land, of Yiddish as a community language, and of Yiddishkeit also. And I think part of these ideas we can see today in like these young secular Yiddish speaking circles, which we see popping up in different areas, but this is of course it was just like an afterthought to bring my paper to a conclusion. But regarding the marches, so I found many of these marches mentioned in some of the flyers I showed you, but I also found some visual pictures of these marches, but most of the pictures I found from the marches are stemming from Germany, from the occupied zone in America and in the Britain occupation zone. So from Poland itself, I haven't found a picture of such a march yet. Oh no, from Warsaw actually I have like the early marches after the war ended through the ruins of Warsaw. So there we have many, and they were usually organized by the survivor Landsmannschaften, and they spread out the word through flyers and calls in Yiddish newspapers to really gather every Jew from their hometown, and they would usually conduct these marches in their former hometown. They would walk through the former ghetto and through the ruins, and usually end either at a cemetery or at a former concentration camp site or at a mass grave. And I think these marches, because they were so visible, they also would bring like from the marches which occurred in German towns next to DP camps, we know that they had like really banners and flyers, and they would sing Yiddish songs. Some even would march in their former camp clothes. So I found also pictures with survivors being in their camp clothes, and also like coming together for group pictures in these clothes. And I think this relates also to what we discussed before, that for the individual survivor, it was often really hard, of course, to speak Yiddish. But once you came together in a community through this forum of a Landsmannschaft, and then go out and conduct these marches, for example, or meet as survivors in a group in the forum of a Landsmannschaft, could really somehow empower you also to like reconnect with Yiddish after the war.
And about how local non-Jews responded, is there anything that you've seen about that?
I know from, like, there's one book, I think it's from Margaret Feierstein, if I'm not mistaken. She wrote about Eastern European Jews in DP camps, and she has one chapter about like the relationships with Jews in the DP camps and non-German Jews outside of the DP camps. And she collected a lot of sources regarding like really hostile anti-Semitic reactions by the direct environment of these DP camps, and like really hostile interactions with Eastern European Jewish survivors also speaking Yiddish.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, so I mean, Kasia, you still haven't responded to David, and then there's also a couple of questions in the chat for you. Yeah, all right, let's see if we can kind of do a sort of omnibus question. So, yeah, you know, since you're not feeling that well, I thought I'd like put you through your paces. So, Hannah, I'm just going to read the questions out that just to save time. Hannah is asking, against whom or what are you arguing with this paper on censorship? Is it an argument about Yiddish authenticity myths or something more specific? And then one from Simo asking, I'm curious to know if there was any criticism against the Zich publications after 1948 in the West, or how much was there discussion, criticism about Zich falling into the hands of the communists?
Yes, all of that. Thank you very much for the remarks. It's incredibly helpful. Regarding the Jewish police, I have lots of thoughts about that, and I think it changes in a sense that if we look at, say, 46, 47, 48, when the on accord by the Central Committee of Jews of Poland is working at full speed, when there's information about it extensively in the Jewish press and in Polish press when it comes to the more bigger cases, when the discussion of publication of Tzaddik Perechodnik is brought up at the meeting of the Central Jewish Historical Commission very, very early on, I think in 46 or 45, there's actually, I mean, they decided not to do it, but nonetheless, there's a discussion whether Perechodnik's diary should not be published. So it is, you know, at least within the internal discussion, I mean, internal communal discussion, because I'm not saying about, you know, within families or advocacy, but it's there. And then it quickly, of course, ends. But I think, especially after, for many reasons, but I think there is this little moment when Perechodnik is seriously considered that as something fit to be published. And I think what's also interesting is to what extent these are individual choices, because Ruta Sakowska makes her editorial changes, quote, editorial changes in 1980s when, you know, Ringelblum's notes in a pretty full edition are already out. Cherniakov's already out. The Ringelblum's notes were actually prepared to be published in 67 already at a, you know, quite, I would say, full edition of them, and weren't, but there was a plan. So I think there's, I don't know, I mean, it's of course my ignorance and lack of like grasping it fully a topic and looking into it much more than when to the level of an article. I think there's still a lot to be done when it comes to that. And publications of this is a really interesting topic, and especially the early ones. The early criticism of Zich's publications comes from those who know what's in the original, which not many people do. So they come from basically only because the only ones who can criticize it, from employees of Zich who leave, such as Kermish writes about it, Blumenthal writes about it. They are the only ones who actually know what's in the original diary of Emanuel Ringelblum, for example, and who can then refer to it and refer to the level of censorship that's introduced. So that's, I think, that. And when it comes to Hannah's question about, I'm arguing again against my own ignorance and my own misconceptions, I think, more than anything else.
Could I, Dominic, could I just add a quick footnote about the question of criticisms of the G? Kasia is obviously entirely correct that the people who are accurately criticizing the censored publications were the people who knew what was in the actual document. So, Blumenthal and Kermisch and others like that. But there was also Halevik had a diatribe against Mark for publishing anonymously a text that later turned out to be written by Shia Perla, the well-known interwar novelist, and a text called Hribin Varsha, and he thought it was entirely a fabrication because it criticized the Jewish police and the Judenrat, and it was much more internally focused in its criticism rather than on the Nazis. And he said no Jew could possibly pen such a thing. This is just communist garbage. And it turned out to be by Perla and Vermark could show that it was absolutely authentic, that he didn't manipulate that text at all. So some of the criticism coming from a sort of a New York-Warsaw feud it quickly became a kind of Cold War issue, but some of the criticisms were actually not well-founded. So.
Right, and I think we do have time. Eric, you had a question for Anna. Maybe if you want to ask it.
Sure. So Anna, I wonder, you mentioned how you described how the survivor Landsmannschaften really provided what you learned. And I'm just wondering, and do you see any evidence also of the Yiddish world was very political and kind of tumultuous in many ways, where a lot of debate and small distinctions, or what's in the kind of rearview mirror looked like sort of small political distinctions, were very big distinctions at the time. And obviously, I'm sure the Hurban leveled a lot of those. But do you also find debate, and do you find hey, you stinking communist, hey, what are you talking about, you Bundist? Are there kind of debates within these Landsmannschaften? Yiddish also is a space of debate and contention rather than simply sort of commemoration and we're here together, we can speak a Yiddish word and remember what we've lost. So was it also a kind of living contentious rambunctious space in any way, or was it simply more sacralized? And obviously more sacralized, but was there any space for kind of disagreement and debate is what I'm wondering. Have you seen any evidence of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard for me to answer because I'm not that far yet in working through the sources. For the immediate survivor Landsmannschaften, which popped up in Eastern Europe or in Poland, I don't have any material proving this assumption, because I think it was really first and foremost really of getting the urgent needs somehow meant to manage. So providing, like, first of all, collecting individual survivors, providing them with a network, with material help, with financial help. So they all did this through these international Landsmannschaften networks. What I know is that in Paris, for example, the Landsmannschaften movement was also kind of strong, right? And there it was more, or there we can see of what I know now, is that like these old kind of pre-war struggles were a little bit more relevant when it comes to Bundism or Zionism. And also the question of how do we commemorate in Yiddish or not in Yiddish, and how inclusive are we for other survivors who maybe don't speak Yiddish. There's much more material, because of course also the material for the Landsmannschaften from Eastern Europe, but also then in DP camps, it's kind of limited. So it's really, sometimes I have only one document, which is left, one flyer from one Landsmannschaft. For the bigger towns, of course, there's more material. For example, Vilna's pretty good covered there. I found a lot of material. Warsaw, Lublin. So there's more, but I'm not so far yet that I can answer this question properly. yeah.
And right, we have 4 minutes left, which is 3 minutes for a question plus 1 minute for announcements. So, Milena, I can see your hands up. So if you'd like to ask your question, but remember, you've got to give.
Thank you. Very short, just to follow up with the last question. I wanted to mention that in the case of Argentina, in the early 50s, the Landsmannschaftsbewegung was already like split in two, literally split in two. The politics were very strong because the Landsmannschaften were involved in organizing commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It began with only the Warschauer Vereinen, but then all the rest of the Jewish community is going to join, and also the other Landsmannschaften. And in an article of, in the 80s, Rojansky actually said that analyzing past failures of the Landsmannschaftsbewegung, and he's saying the problem was that the Landsmannschaften got too much involved in politics, and that was the seed of their dissolution. So I think this is in the context of the Cold War. One thing is that 1946, 47, but when you get a bit later and early into the 50s, this is a subject that you won't be able to avoid, because the Cold War had a great impact also in every sector, and also in the Landsmannschaften.
Yeah, definitely. This is, I remembered now also that I made a note that I know it from Landsmannschaften in New York, which also commemorated the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that they were also kind of split it between the politics, if it's more Bundist or not. Yeah. So thank you for this comment. It's good information for me to look also into Argentina, because I haven't done yet. It's a lot of material to conduct. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions to this panel, for our three speakers, discussants, and for all of you in the audience who posted such probing and thoughtful questions. I think it's been a really productive discussion, and I think I should wrap it up there and give Hanoi Jovita time just for their 1 minute. Yes, there it is. The 1 minute has come for announcements.
Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to Dominic. I'm taking it all in, and I'm really also glad that this was a historical panel, and I like the historical specificity. I gained a lot from this panel,